Morning, everyone. My name's Tommy Mullaney. I'm a program manager on the SQL Server team, engineering team at Microsoft, and I'm really excited to be here this week and today to talk to you about a project that my team has been working on for a while, and that is bringing SQL Server over to Linux, in particular to SUSE Linux. And it's a really exciting time for us, and I hope for you, our customers. And I know that talking about databases isn't always necessarily the most exciting topic, at least judging by my dinner table conversations at home, but I think this is something that actually is worth getting excited about. And even my siblings can at least appreciate something crazy is going on. So I wanted to start by just doing a quick poll of the room to get a sense for how many folks here have used SQL Server in the past. Okay, so that's most, but not all. And how many people are using SQL Server today, currently? So a couple more. And how many of you, I guess the last of you there, are actually involved in the SQL Server on Linux private preview? Anyone? Okay, I have some work to do then. So that's great. I will try to tailor my talking points so that I can address that. So what I want to start with today is a little bit about kind of what we're doing and why we're doing it. Then hopefully show you a couple of demos, fingers crossed, knock on wood, so you don't have to just take my word for everything here, and close with a glimpse at where we're going and what's next and what you can do to get involved with SQL Server running on Linux. So without fail, the first question that anybody asks when they hear that I work on bringing SQL Server over to Linux is why? Why in the world is Microsoft bringing its prized database over to run on Linux? And the question to me is kind of simultaneously obvious and a little weird at the same time. I can appreciate that. And the answer kind of comes back to Microsoft's mission statement and under our CEO, Satya Nadella. And that mission statement is that Microsoft is going to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. And it may sound corny to some, but I think it actually rings very true and is something that is embodied very directly with the effort to bring SQL Server over to Linux. And at the core of this mission statement of empowering every person and every organization is this idea of choice and of openness. And I think if you look over the last couple of years at some of the things that Microsoft has done and announced, you'll see that there are actually a lot of things that the company has done to further our pursuit of this particular mission. So for example, some things like making Linux, including SLES, a first-class citizen on our Azure cloud. One thing that I'd note is that the latest SLES 12 SP2 images are already up and available on the Azure cloud. Support for Linux with Hyper-V, our hypervisor. Things like bringing or building Visual Studio Code, actually a really nice code editor that I personally am a huge fan of, to run cross-platform, not just on Windows, but on Linux and on Macs. Things like making PowerShell run on Linux. I know that's a surprise to a lot of people. Things like R Server, Microsoft R Server, and making it available on Linux to do advanced data analytics. And really running SQL Server or bringing SQL Server over to Linux is just one more example of Microsoft working in pursuit of this mission. And some of the ways that we think about it on the team is that whatever data type you're using, whether that's JSON or IoT data or spatial data, whatever you have, SQL Server can store it. SQL Server can work with it. Whatever programming language you're using, whether that's Java, Node, C#, of course, PHP, Python, Ruby, SQL Server can connect to it. You can connect to SQL Server using that language. Whatever cloud you're using, whether that's public or private, whether that is Google's cloud. We now have VM images up on Google's cloud. We've had them up and available on AWS and Rackspace for quite a while. And of course, we think SQL runs pretty well on our Azure cloud as well, both in a platform as a service model with Azure SQL Database, where a lot of the infrastructure work like backups and high availability is managed for you, as well as in an infrastructure as a service model where we have VM images that run SQL Server. So all the clouds, and now all the various platforms that people are using, these will all support SQL Server. So not just Windows Server, but the various flavors of Linux, as well as things like Docker containers, SQL Server running in a Docker container. We want to make sure that SQL Server is able to run in all of these places because our customers are increasingly using all of these platforms, data types, languages, clouds. And the mantra at the end of the day is we want our customers, developers, DBAs, IT departments, you name it, to have that choice of building their applications and their solutions wherever they want, using whatever stack they want. And we want to make sure SQL Server can be a part of that. So that's a big part of the reason why we're doing this thing of bringing SQL Server over to Linux. So because I know not everybody in the room may be very familiar with SQL Server, I want to quickly run through some of the reasons why you might consider SQL Server in the first place versus some of the other competing database systems on the market. And there's kind of four big reasons. There's a handful of others, but I want to focus on four of them and then move on to the Linux-specific stuff. But one is that SQL Server is an industry leader when it comes to databases. And in fact, this past year, Gartner actually rated SQL Server as #1, ahead of Oracle, ahead of IBM, you name it, #1 in its Magic Quadrant for operational databases. This is both in terms of completeness of vision and ability to execute. And this was a really meaningful thing for us. And that's that upper right, that very top, very tiny dot there. That is Microsoft. And SQL Server has similar, and Microsoft has similar leadership positions in the data warehousing Magic Quadrant and in the BI and analytics Magic Quadrant. So industry leadership is one. Another is that SQL Server is the most secure relational database system out there. If you look at NIST's national database for vulnerabilities, SQL Server consistently has fewer vulnerabilities than our leading competitors, like Oracle, for instance, or MySQL. But in addition to the vulnerability side of things, there's also been a lot of investment into the security capabilities and features of SQL Server, particularly in the last couple of years, with features like always encrypted, for instance, is a new one that was made available in the latest release of SQL Server that enables you to transparently encrypt columns of data such that even your highly privileged database administrators or a hacker who gains total access to the database has no access to the keys and no ability to decrypt your most sensitive data points. Other features like row-level security and dynamic data masking are also new. So there's been a concerted effort to make sure that the security stance of SQL Server is at the top of the industry. In addition to security, everybody cares about performance. And this is also where SQL Server really shines. If you look at the benchmarks for mission-critical database workloads, like TPC-E and TPC-H, SQL Server has the top spots, and sometimes multiple of the top spots and ahead of Oracle. And similarly, there have been really big investments from the product team's perspective into technologies like our in-memory OLTP, basically being able to run or store your tables in memory and natively compile stored procedures to allow you to achieve orders of magnitude of performance increase over traditional disk-based tables. Things like column store indexes enable you to do analytics queries, similarly with orders of magnitude improvements over traditional row store tables. And these are very popular features of SQL Server and real differentiators, we believe. And finally, to cap it all off, a SQL Server presentation wouldn't be complete without at least some mention of Oracle. And one of the things that makes SQL Server different, particularly vis-a-vis folks like Oracle, is that everything is built in. And what this means is SQL Server is able to provide an industry-leading total cost of ownership, or TCO. And in particular, looking at Oracle, it's typically in a kind of a 12x improvement in terms of cost. So these are just a handful of the reasons why we think SQL Server is a pretty compelling database. We certainly are big believers in it, and it's used across Microsoft to power a lot, most of our stuff. But rather than dwelling on the sales pitch too much, I want to transition over and start talking a bit more directly about what we're doing with SQL on Linux.
So on the onboarding and so do you have any early data on how it performs on Linux? And what's your target compared to running Windows?
Sure. Okay. You mean SQL Server on Windows and SQL Server on Linux? Yeah, totally. So, so our goal here is we want customers to be able to run the exact same mission-critical Tier 1 enterprise workloads on SQL Server on Linux, the same ones that they're running with SQL Server on Windows. It shouldn't matter. And based on where we are now, we're pretty close. Things are looking pretty good. We still have a few more optimizations that are in progress with some of our code paths. But that is the goal, and we are on track to being exactly there. So yeah. So where are we now, and how did we get here? So SQL Server on Linux was announced in March this year, and to much buzz, there were tweets about, it's the end of days. Maybe there are some today. Tweets kind of saying, okay, pigs are flying, hell is frozen over, what's going on, what is Microsoft doing? It was a really exciting thing for us on the team. I can tell you that the building was electric. And within the first week, more than half of the Fortune 500 companies had signed up and registered for our private preview. And ultimately, we today have more than 20,000 people have signed up and registered for the preview. So the numbers have been just overwhelming, and the support has been really positive. And so what we started doing is back in March, we started gradually onboarding folks to our private preview. Basically, they would sign an NDA with us. We'd give them access to the preview bits to start playing around with it. And they'd have direct access to the product group. And there's a really good exchange of feedback that was really, really helpful. And we started ramping this up over the first few months. Obviously, we were cautious at first because we wanted to make sure that our kind of systems to onboard people and get people involved were bulletproof. And what we found is that for a lot of people, they'd be really excited. All right, yeah, give it to me. Let's go. Let's get started. And they'd get it. They'd install SQL Server. They'd kind of start playing around with it. And they go, this is so cool. I have SQL Server running on Linux. And then it would kind of settle in, and they go, okay, well, it's just SQL Server. And we were like, well, yeah, that's kind of the point. It should just be SQL Server. That is what you signed up for. And that reaction was interesting. And what it helped us to realize is that we need to get more people to start yelling at us, to start giving us a hard time, to start really harping on us for the bugs and things that just aren't quite right. Or, hey, I've got this other program here that I depend on, and it isn't supported with SQL on Linux yet. And so what we started doing is we started ramping up our onboarding process pretty aggressively, particularly in the September timeframe. And you can see there's a pretty notable spike there in the bottom here. This is the number of folks we have in our preview over time. And yeah, it was a wild month. We onboarded lots and lots of people. And the feedback has been really, really helpful. We've learned an awful lot from our preview customers. And the goal with all of this has been getting real workloads, whether that's your production workloads, copies of your production workloads, or automated tests, or what have you, getting real scenarios up and running against SQL Server on Linux, because that is the best way for us to really test SQL Server's readiness for the real world. And it's been a really positive thing. Today we have more than 2,000 people in our private preview. And I don't know what the dictionary or technical definition of a private preview is, or what the limits are for an NDA, but my guess is once you hit 2,000, you're kind of moving past that. I'm not sure it's so private anymore. So we will be moving into a public preview phase fairly soon, where SQL Server will be downloadable by anybody, not just folks that have an NDA with us. So that's kind of where we are today and how we've gotten here. Now, I have a laundry list slide here, but before we jump into that, I want to preface this by talking about where are we going with SQL Server on Linux, and what is the goal for our first release. And so the timeline here is, and what was announced back in March, is that SQL Server on Linux is going to be generally available in mid-2017, so halfway through next year. And what this includes, what's in scope, is the core relational database engine. So this doesn't include, for instance, if you're familiar with our analysis services or reporting services or integration services. These are kind of other pieces of the SQL Server suite of products. These are not coming to Linux in this first release just yet. We're prioritizing those later. We're focusing on the core relational engine for now. You can still use those other pieces running on Windows and connect them to SQL Server running on Linux, but they themselves won't be on Linux. And as mentioned, this is mid-2017 that we're slated for release. So one thing I want to poll the room on for my own curiosity is how many folks knew before coming here today that SQL Server was going to be available on Linux partway through next year? Okay, so most of you, but not everybody. And so we'll tell our marketing team we're doing okay, but we gotta keep working to make sure that we get the word out. So that's the plan with SQL Server on Linux. And in general, we want the reaction to be very similar to what we've heard from folks in our private preview, and that is, well, it's just SQL Server. Of course it is. And so in general, maybe 95% of features we have working. And this, particularly anything that's related to programming an application or coding related, that stuff should all and does all just work with SQL Server. There is a class of features that are going to be partially supported. So for instance, things like SQL Server Agent, for example. That's not going to open up a Windows command prompt on Linux. It just doesn't make sense. There are some features that don't work today, but the team is currently working on and will be part of our GA release next year. These would be things like always-on availability groups, which is SQL Server's flagship high availability solution based on replication. Things like Active Directory authentication, we're hard at work on. This has been a huge ask, particularly from enterprise customers. Full text search would be another example of something that we're working on right now and working to bringing to the product. So those are just a couple examples of things that we're working on that are in progress. And then there is a class of features that are just never going to be part of SQL Server on Linux because they don't make sense. So one example of this is there's this kind of obscure feature of SQL Server called file table that is based on Win32 shares, and just it doesn't make sense in the context of Linux. But the message at the end of the day is that it is SQL Server. It's the same SQL Server that some of you are familiar with and used to. It's not some toned down or souped down version of SQL Server. It's the real thing. And at the same time, while it is the same SQL Server that folks know and love, we've also gone to great efforts on the product group to make sure that we're good Linux citizens as we bring it over to Linux. And we've been working closely with folks like the SUSE team to make sure that as we bring SQL Server to Linux, we're doing it in the right ways. So I want to quickly just run through a couple highlights from this laundry list here to give you a sense for what types of things are included in this SQL Server on Linux release. So what was announced in March and what we have today is support for RHEL, Ubuntu, and Docker. SUSE and SLES support is currently running here and back in Redmond, but we haven't made it available to our private preview customers yet. It's coming very, very soon. To the point about, and I have a demo today, hopefully, to actually showcase this to you. We're really proud and happy about it. Support for package-based installs was something that was really important to us, particularly in this kind of being a good Linux citizen stance. One thing that was kind of funny is when we announced SQL Server on Linux back in March, there was a tweet that someone posted that said, all right, we're taking bets. What do we think here? There's a poll. Is Microsoft going to have this crappy, ugly, bloated installer wizard thing for SQL Server on Linux, or is it going to have this beautiful, streamlined, package-based install experience? And we all thought that was pretty funny because we'd actually put a lot of thought into this and had made sure that we have the package-based install experience that everybody has come to love and expect on Linux. So zipper install MS SQL Server would be the SUSE and SLES variant there. And yeah, no, I'm super happy about it. It's super nice. So package-based installs, there's a Docker image, SQL Server running in Docker. That's raised a bunch of eyebrows, but it's something that's really important to us. You come to a conference like this, and it's containers, containers, containers. Everybody's talking about containers. And it's really important to us that SQL Server works in containerized environments. So Docker pull, we're there. Another interesting one that we actually got working just recently, and if luck is with us, I can show you today, is failover clustering. So one of the HA and DR capabilities that SQL Server supports is called failover cluster instances, where you have a shared disk, maybe a cluster shared volume for your data files, and you have multiple instances or nodes with SQL Server running that are pointing to the same files, and if one of them fails over, then the other one transparently takes over. And with on Windows, that's based using Windows clustering technologies. On Linux, we've got it to work, for instance, using SUSE's own high availability extension with Pacemaker, and so that's pretty cool. Obviously, backup and restore is a very popular way for folks to bring SQL Server databases on Windows over to Linux. And that's something that a lot of people ask about, is say, hey, I've got a bunch of SQL servers running up on Windows. Is it going to be a nightmare for me to bring them over to Linux? And the answer is no. You can detach the database files and move them over and reattach them to your SQL Server on Linux. You can take a backup and restore it over on Linux. You can move it back and forth, no problem. It's just the same as moving it between two Windows instances.
One question.
Yeah.
From application perspective,
Mm-hmm.
Does an application know then whether it's running on Windows SQL or Linux SQL?
So it doesn't have to, but it can. So we have, for instance, at the bottom here, DMVs, or dynamic management views, are some views that we have, system views built into SQL Server that you can query and get information about the underlying operating system. So if the application wants to know what SQL Server is running on, it can ask, but it's transparent to the application. Yeah.
For the application?
Yeah.
No difference.
It makes no difference. It's the same TDS protocol that SQL Server uses to connect. It's the same database file formats. It's the same thing. So the application doesn't have to care. And to your point, SQL Server Management Studio is actually something that a lot of SQL Server users use very extensively, and it's very well regarded as a really top-notch database systems management tool. And SQL Server Management Studio, or SSMS, running on Windows can connect to SQL Server on Linux. It doesn't care. It connects the exact same way. You can manage it the exact same way. And so if you have a bunch of DBAs that are used to using tools like SSMS on Windows, those will all still work if SQL Server is running on Linux. You don't have to change anything. From a management perspective, it's the same. Yeah?
So do you have any plan when you can make everything available on Linux only without Windows?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's plenty of ways to connect to SQL Server on Linux or wherever from a Linux client. And so we have our command line tools, for example. A lot of people ask about, okay, what about GUI tools if we have like a Linux desktop that we're using to manage our database? And I can't comment right now on kind of what the story is there, but I would ask you to stay tuned. And if this is something that you are interested in, if you do use, for instance, a SUSE desktop OS, and that's your kind of primary workstation for connecting to databases, I'd certainly love to hear about it, and it'd be great to understand what types of things you are doing on a day-to-day basis as you manage your databases. So actually, that's something. Let me just get a sense from the room. Who uses either SUSE or some other Linux operating system as their client workstation? Okay. That makes sense at SUSECON. That's really good to see. So if any of you manage databases, whether as developers, DBAs, or what have you, analysts, doesn't matter, I'd love to hear a little bit more about, if you come find me either afterwards here at the booth, I'd love to hear a little bit more about what are the types of tasks that you're doing with your databases regularly from those Linux machines. Yeah?
So the current plan is to only have engine, SQL engine available, and you have to use Windows. So basically, you need multiple systems to manage.
No, you don't have to have Windows. You do not have to have Windows. I want to be clear about that. It's the same. Yeah, so we have a number of different client drivers that work on Linux. Every major programming language is supported. There's lots of tools that you can use to connect, and I'll show you a couple that you can use to connect to SQL Server from a Linux machine. For instance, to point out a couple, SQL CMD, it's a command line tool for connecting to SQL Server. That obviously works on Linux and to Linux. There's an open source tool called SQL CLI that runs on Node that I'm actually a big fan of that also obviously can connect to SQL Server on Linux. We've ported over things like BCP and SQL package to do things like bulk copy or movement of data from the Linux command line, or SQL package is good for kind of managing migrations and things like that. So that all works on Linux. And so it's the same TDS protocol. So any tools that can connect to SQL Server on Windows can connect to SQL Server on Linux. So you shouldn't have to be reinventing workloads and workflows. And as mentioned, if you are interested in a tool from Microsoft that kind of does, or a GUI tool that does kind of this management, I'd love to chat about it. So a couple other features to highlight here. This is where my security background is going to show through. I'm a little biased, and I apologize because I was on the security team a couple years ago. Transparent data encryption is an increasingly popular feature of SQL Server. Basically, this provides encryption at rest of your entire database, and it's completely transparent to the application. You just flip it on, and your database is now encrypted. So every time data is read to and from disk, it's encrypted and decrypted. And this is a really popular thing, particularly for folks who need kind of a compliance checkbox saying, hey, we're protected at rest. And so that's a very, very popular feature. Backup encryption does a similar kind of thing. There's a System Center Operations Manager management pack for SQL Server that works with SQL Server running on Linux. There's also a management pack for SUSE Linux. And so if you happen to be using SCOM today, SQL Server on Linux will integrate seamlessly into that. On the programming features side, to the point that I made earlier, and I want to emphasize again, all of the drivers that work and connect to SQL Server, those things work with SQL Server on Linux. And I think you'll notice, if you haven't already, that there's a concerted effort across the team to make sure that we are getting all of the drivers for all of the different languages and on all of the different OSs and platforms to the same level where they need to be to connect to SQL Server on Linux. And so I would keep an eye out for new stuff there, even in the coming months. There's a lot of work being put into our drivers to make sure that whatever language you're using for your application, you can connect to SQL Server. I mentioned before, in-memory OLTP and column store are two really popular performance-related features of SQL Server. In-memory OLTP, you store tables in memory, and you can natively compile stored procedures. And the performance gains that folks will see with this is 10 to 30x. Or sometimes even 100x, to be honest. It's really, really market. And this is a really compelling feature of SQL Server, and there's been a lot of improvements to it that came in the most recent release of SQL Server, and these will all propagate and be available with SQL Server on Linux. And so this is something that, in talking to, for instance, a lot of our preview customers, this is something that a lot of folks are really excited about. Column store is similarly a very powerful performance capability, whereas in-memory OLTP is geared towards these online transaction processing workloads. Column store is particularly well suited for analytical workloads where you're doing large scans of large amounts of data, and you're doing aggregations on top of them. And by storing data in columnar format rather than in the traditional row store format, you get this massive amount of data compression, and your queries will speed up by similarly kind of sometimes up to 100x. It's really, really big. And so this is a very powerful feature as well. You can even use these two together in a scenario that we call operational analytics, where you have your hot data, the stuff that's being updated really rapidly by a transaction system. That's done using the in-memory OLTP systems. So you get to keep your very fast transaction processing workload there. And your warm data gets pushed into this column store format so that you can do your analytics and your OLTP on the same place without having to do this complicated ETL process of piping it all over to a data warehouse and things like that. So that's a particularly cool new capability that is also available with SQL Server on Linux. Query store is a really popular one amongst DBAs. It basically lets you keep track of regressed queries and query plans. And basically, if you're a performance geek and like to fine-tune all of your queries, this is your best friend. This tool is pretty cool. It tracks lots of performance stats for all of your queries and helps you identify regressions that may have happened due to an application upgrade, or maybe you upgraded to a new version of SQL Server and switched on to a new cardinality estimator, things like that. Always encrypted, as I mentioned, is a new security feature that's available in SQL Server. And basically what it offers is transparent client-side encryption. So rather than encrypting data on the server, for instance, the Linux machine or the Windows machine, wherever SQL Server is running, the data is encrypted and decrypted on the client. And what this means is that somebody who's an administrator of the SQL Server instance, or somebody who hacks in and gets total control of the box, they don't have any ability to see the plain text data because they don't necessarily have access to the keys. Only your application tier has access to the keys. And so for your really sensitive data points, things like social security numbers or account numbers, things like that, always encrypted enables you to just flip on encryption on a particular column, and you know that you have this extra layer of protection. So again, really interesting feature in light of this increased focus on security across the industry over the last couple of years, and it's something that's also very useful from a compliance standpoint.
So on that, key rotation is then the client's responsibility?
Yeah, so the key management, is all the client's responsibility. You can use HSMs if you want. You can use things like Azure Key Vault, or you can use kind of local certificate stores on the client machine. Yeah, the key point with it is, it's all client side because we don't want anybody server side to be able to see or touch any of that unless you want them to. So that's the value prop there. Row-level security and dynamic data masking are two other security capabilities added there. Row-level security is kind of what it sounds like. Control read and write access to individual rows. And data masking allows you to control which parts of particular fields of data are exposed, like last couple digits of a phone number or something like that. And auditing has been a feature of SQL Server for many years, and it's also, of course, available in SQL on Linux. One other one to call out that surprises a lot of people and they find kind of interesting is CLR support. So one feature of SQL Server is support for CLR types, things like spatial or geometric data types to do geo processing. That's supported with SQL Server on Linux, as well as assemblies that you create, CLR assemblies that you create. So for folks that are using CLR with their SQL Server workloads on Windows, if you're using safe assemblies, those will work with SQL Server on Linux. JSON, super popular these days, and we've added new capabilities to SQL Server that allow it to work very easily and very nicely with JSON data, similar to what we have had for XML for a while. And of course, one of the big things that our team has been doing very aggressively for the last few months and will continue to do for the foreseeable future is work with our third-party tools and partners to make sure that the robust ecosystem that surrounds SQL Server works seamlessly, whether it's with SQL Server on Linux or on Windows or wherever else. So that's a rundown of the laundry list. But what's more fun than reading about it is actually doing it. And I know it's a lot more fun for you and a lot more nerve-wracking for me. And let's go ahead and dive into that and see what we can show you. So I'm going to switch over into demo mode. I'm actually going to sit down for a second. OK. So what I want to start with is something that is not Windows. So this is where you get to see how does the Microsoft guy deal with things when he doesn't have his precious start menu. All right, so here we go. This is SLES 12 SP2 that I've got running here, and SQL Server is running on it. And you are the first people outside of Microsoft to see this. So I mentioned the SQL CMD tool, the command line tool that you can use from Linux. You can install. You could also install things like SQL CLI, just npm install SQL CLI. And we're going to connect to localhost. Just going to use the SA account because I don't care about security for demos. and the password's in an environment variable, so I don't have to mess up typing it in front of you. Okay, so it looks like that worked. Let's do this is the hello world of SQL Server. Okay, SQL Server is running on SLES 12 SP2. And this is something that is really exciting for us. This is hot off the press. We just got this working a couple weeks ago. And we're really excited to make this available to customers very soon. So this is an example of using, from a Linux machine, connecting to SQL Server, running on Linux. Ah, great. That's exactly what I wanted. I unfortunately have a kind of meager, I'll come back, a meager laptop here that's resource constrained, so I'm trying to connect to, oh goodness. Give me one moment. Say that again? Yeah, they're the best, right? My absolute favorite. Let's give it a chance to connect back. All right, it's going. Oh no. We're connected to the network. Connected to the VPN. Let's give this one more try. I may need to rejigger the network. Yep, okay. Let me disconnect and reconnect. Sorry about all this Windows 10 here. So to give you a preview of some of the demos that I'd like to do here, so one of the first things that folks ask about with SQL Server on Linux is, okay, how do I bring my SQL Server on Windows over to SQL Server on Linux? And so I want to show you how you can take a backup of your SQL Server running on Windows and pretty seamlessly move it over to Linux. All right, if this is not going to run, then I'll attempt to do it locally. Whoops. Let's unpause this guy. Okay.
So SQL is an RPM package?
Yes. Yeah, it's an RPM package, exactly. So to the point about package-based installs.
It's under control of system B.
I'm sorry?
It's under control of system B.
There you go. Yes. That's how you do it. All right. So, double check this. Okay. So, what I want to do here is show you. Make sure that we're able to connect to this guy. Hopefully the IP address didn't change on me. Unfortunately, didn't have time to get my hosts file set up on the laptop. Have it on the other machine. I think that's right. No, it's different. Let me jot that down. One sec. Swap this out. Whoops. Come on. Got that right, didn't I? I think I did. All right, well, if we're connected now, the other thing we can try is get our remote desktop back where everything in theory is working. So while we're waiting for this guy to come back up, are there any other questions around SQL Server on Linux?
So I can run SQL Server in the Docker container on Windows 2016.
Yes. If you so desire, yes.
You mentioned that there's a lot of effort being put
Yeah.
How far does that extend? For example, are you guys also contributing to like ORM for Rails or Django?
Yeah. That is something where we're actively participating and talking to folks, for instance, with the Django project and on Rails to make sure that SQL Server integrates nicely with those. So yeah, there is active work being done on both of those. No. Yeah, there's a lot of work being put into ORMs that we know a lot of customers, particularly app developers, are taking advantage of ORMs. All right, what's going on here?
How big is the installation?
There we go. It's a good question. It changed dramatically recently. It got much, much smaller. It should be on the order of a few hundred megabytes.
I think Michael told me it was like 175.
Okay, yeah, and that sounds right. I know that there was a huge difference that they were able to make recently.
Like 350 or something.
Yeah, they were able to pull out some stuff that they didn't need there. So, okay, so I'm at least connected here to the local laptop. You can see that this is running on SLES. And I've also got SQL Server running on the Windows part of my laptop here. And so one thing I want to do here is if we jump over to the Windows machine here, I've got this column store demo database. And what I want to do is I want to take a backup of this database so that I can move it over to Linux. And so I'm just going to store it in my C drive here. This is standard operating procedure if you're used to taking backups. I'm a little resource constrained, so you can see it's executing here. And so if anybody's used to managing SQL Server before, this is how you would take a backup. You can also, of course, script it out using T-SQL, but for folks who like to use the SSMS tools, that certainly works for you. So now the next thing that we need to do is copy that on over to, all right, that's still working, keep an eye on that, is copy that backup file over to the Linux machine. And so one of the ways that I like to do that is using my favorite new feature in the latest Windows 10 anniversary update, the bash prompt, which is just great if you like to use bash rather than the Windows command line. And so, for instance, let me there's the backup file that I just took. You can notice that this is not your typical Windows syntax. And what's nice about using this bash shell is that I can just SCP that column store demo backup file over to, what was the address here? Over to the Linux machine, and I'm going to stick it in the data directory for SQL Server running on that Linux machine. So in our case, that's var opt msql/data. Oops, I think I totally mistyped that. Okay. That's why I don't like typing passwords in demos. I always get it wrong. So we're going to copy this file over. It's not a small thing. I've created a table with I think 5 million rows. So it's moving it over. Go laptop go.
Is the database set up to run this group? Or are you
No.
creating a SQL Server?
There's an MS SQL user. Yeah. So from a security standpoint, it runs as a least privileged account. It does not run as root. For my purposes here and just copying stuff over, I'm running as root, but that is not what you would do in a normal production setting. Okay, so that's there. Let's cancel this and try again. Because I'd really like to show you a couple of the other demos that I only have working over there. But in any case, let's switch over. So if we can see that the backup file is now over here in our data directory. And actually, I'm going to go back just to show you that you can do this thing end-to-end using the SQL Server Management Studio tool. So if we go over to this SQL Server instance running on SLES, I'll let it connect. we're going to go restore database. Definitely need to ask for a RAM upgrade. Come on, let's go. This guy's still going too. Great. Let's cancel that for now. Come on.
File should fail and copy the MS root. The backup file should be root permissions only. And SQL is running this MS SQL user should not be able to read the backup file.
That is correct. In this particular case, I told a minor fib because right now it's running as root because this is a dev setup here. But when you install through a package manager, then if we create a new user, MS SQL, and SQL Server runs as that user. All right, let's try reconnecting here. Hope I got that right.
Is it possible to create a multiple instance on the same server?
Yeah, so the approach that we would recommend for that is to use Docker containers. So if you want to run multiple instances on the same machine, Docker containers would be the way to go. And assuming I can get connection to my other box, I'd love to show you guys an example using Docker Compose with SQL Server and kind of this microservices type arrangement. Okay, so now we're using SSMS, again, connected to that SQL Server running on SLES. And you can find this column store demo backup file on the box. Those of you with inquisitive eyes will notice this pesky C drive thing that's up there in the top of the screen. Yes, we are well aware of this, and it is going away. That will be replaced with pretty native Linux file paths. I just don't have it just yet on this particular build. So okay, we're going to do that. There's also a little bit of metadata that we want to remap with this backup file because it contains what are the file paths of the database file, the data file, and the log file. So we're going to remap those as well. Then we're going to say go. So you can see up here, we're working on it. All of those millions of rows of data are now being restored over there. Almost done. Won't jinx it by changing anything.
How does the configuration look like of the server?
Yeah. So we have a tool called MS SQL Conf that you can either via command line, you can configure all the normal stuff that you'd expect with SQL Server ports and things like that. You can also use a config file to do the same thing. So if you like to script stuff out with kind of like a container manager or something like that, you can take advantage of that. Okay, so we've restored the thing. I actually want to switch over. Let's give this thing one more go. We may run out of time, so I may need to show some of you this over at the demo booth. But I want to switch back over to here, and if we kind of do the same thing, you can now see that we have this column store demo log file and data file that are now here. And if we SQL CMD connect, oh, come on, work, work, work. Just go directly. All right. So now if we use the column store demo database, we have this orders table, and I've been telling you it has a bunch of rows in it. So let's do select count. We'll let it go. Okay. So there's 5 million rows in this table. So it's not small. It's not massive either. We've seen much bigger tables, running workloads against SQL Server, but it's big enough for us to actually see something. So if we do kind of a normal analytical query, something like select average price from orders. Actually, before I do that, well, we'll let it go. But one thing I want to do before that is actually want to set statistics time on. Now, let's select the average price. Okay, so you can see CPU time and elapsed time here. This just gives us some basic stats about the query. And so we're doing a full scan of the table here. It's a traditional row store table, standard primary key clustered index. And what I want to show you is if we do It's going to take a few seconds because it needs to run through a bunch of million rows on my poor little machine here. But if we switch this table over to be that column store type of table that I was telling you about earlier, where data is stored in this columnar format rather than row store, you'll see that this actually makes a very big difference on these types of queries. Now, obviously, if you have a transactional workload that's very hot and does a lot of inserts and updates and deletes, then this is not the ideal storage format of your data. But if you have, for instance, a more analytical workload or using data warehouses, then this actually can make a huge difference. So if we do that same, there's a big difference. And obviously, this is not the most scientific way of going about doing this, but this is pretty clear what the difference is. We went from 1,466 milliseconds of CPU time down to 14 by switching our table over to use a column store index. So big differences there. That's one of the reasons why column store is so interesting to so many of our customers that are doing data warehousing workloads in particular. So I can see that we're running a little low on time. In the interests of not going after demos that aren't going to work, let me switch back over to the presentation, which, of course, was also on that other machine. But that doesn't matter. I think I have it in here. Let's use the document viewer. And this guy here, because who needs PowerPoint? Right?
F5.
F5. I have one of these wonderful Lenovo ThinkPads where the F5 key runs and hides. Okay. Okay. So that was a couple demos. Some stuff that if you come by the Microsoft booth, I'd love to show you is we have a failover cluster instance working with 2 SLES nodes running SQL Server with a shared disk being used to store data, and we can fail over back and forth. Also would love to show you an example using Docker Compose, where SQL Server is running in a container, and you have other containers that are running other services on top of it and connecting to it and working with it. But what I want to leave you with in the last few minutes here is a quick look at what's coming next and how you can get involved and start trying out SQL Server on Linux. So obviously, from an engineering perspective, what our team is working on is expanding the set of features and capabilities that are available in SQL Server on Linux. And we're doing this based on what customers are telling us and asking for. And in particular, folks who are trying to get workloads up and running in production and are blocked by something. That is what we are prioritizing. So things like SLES support, things like always-on availability groups, things like full-text search and Active Directory authentication. The team is working like literally right now on making these things happen. We're also working very closely with our partners to make sure that the third-party ecosystem that surrounds SQL Server and the ISV applications that take advantage of SQL Server can all work with SQL Server running on Linux. So if you happen to be one of those people who's developing an application or a tool that uses or connects to SQL Server, I would love to chat with you about it because we want to make sure that by the time we hit GA, and ideally before then, your application supports or your solution supports SQL Server on Linux. If you fall into the category of a customer, enterprise or otherwise, that uses SQL Server, and if you have an interest in potentially using SQL Server on Linux in a production setting with a production workload before we go generally available mid-2017 next year, then we do have a program where we will work with you to make that happen. And that includes a direct access to the product group. That includes advanced notice and a little bit of influence into the roadmap because we want to make sure that we unblock you, whatever blockers you may have. And that includes full production support before we become generally available through a specific support channel that's dedicated to your workload. And obviously, from Microsoft's perspective, what's really valuable about this is we get that real-world testing. And it's not just looking for bugs and problems with the functionality or the implementation of our stuff. It's also looking for non-bug blockers that prevent you from using an SQL Server in production. For instance, say there's a monitoring tool or a security monitoring tool that your organization uses and is required. If that doesn't work with SQL Server on Linux, you probably can't use it. We want to make sure that we work with that vendor to make sure that SQL Server is supported. So this is the best way that we know of to really vet all the different scenarios, the real production scenarios that customers need. So if you fit into either of these two categories, I'd love for you to come talk to me. Either after the session here, I'll stick around for a few minutes, or come find me at the Microsoft booth. And the last thing I'll leave you with here is I would encourage all of you to sign up. If you go to microsoft.com/SQL Server on Linux, you can register for our preview, and this is the best way to keep up to date with what's new and what's going on with SQL Server on Linux. I think maybe once a month or so, we send out an email with kind of a recap of, hey, what's new, what's coming next, and this is the best way to keep in touch with us about what's going on. So that's microsoft.com/SQL Server on Linux. I would also encourage you all to watch for announcements. Microsoft has a conference called Connect that's happening next week. And I can't speak to what's being announced there, but I would encourage all of you to keep an eye on that. So that's next week. And if you have any interest in the early adoption program, either as a partner, ISV, third-party tool, or as an end user of SQL Server with an interest in using the product in production before we go GA next year, I would absolutely love to talk to you, and I would love to help you get involved and get started with SQL Server running on Linux. So with that, I think we're basically at time, so I'll turn it over to any questions that you have. I'll do my best to answer them.
You mentioned packaging this RPM. Can you speak more to how that's going to be delivered?
Yeah, so Microsoft has a repo, and basically you add our repository, and then it's as simple as zipper install, yum install, or apt-get install, whatever is your pleasure.
The repo is not well advertised at this point.
No. Yeah, so right now we're in this private preview phase where only our private preview participants have access to this repo, but that's how you're going to, once we're public preview, that's how folks will be able to. Yes, yes, absolutely.
Some of the information that we're going to start putting more down here. Some of the other things that Microsoft is distributing for Linux in very good ways are not going to weird for Microsoft holding the ways we're going to start putting in this repo.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
How will the pricing look like? Exactly the same as in Windows?
Yeah, so what was announced earlier this year is basically if you buy a license for SQL Server, you can use that license to run SQL Server on Windows or on Linux or wherever. So it's not different. Yeah. I saw a hand over here.
Basically, I have the same question.
Same question? Yeah.
I can extend the question. So we have plans for the support statement. I know this is a bit early, but we've planned or is positioned as a support statement is the same on the
It's the same support model. We're working very hard to make sure that our support team is trained to handle cases with SQL Server on various distributions. So it's not going to be a different support model in that sense. It's the same thing. Any other questions?
On the technical side, SQL Server probably also are using Visual Studio and Visual C compiler. They not use that or depends on that.
Yeah, so I have a slide on the how, but I think it's going to turn into a little bit longer of a discussion if we go into that. But basically, the gist of it is the way SQL Server works on Linux is we have a platform abstraction layer that we've built. We're calling it SQL PAL. And basically, that SQL PAL includes extensions to our SQL OS to kind of abstract out a lot of things. The SQL OS has existed for many years, and we basically expanded that. And there's a host extension layer that basically translates the syscalls from SQL OS into the native Linux, in this case, syscalls. And that host extension is natively compiled on Linux. but you're using the same SQL Server binaries up above it. So those are Windows binaries running on top of it. So yeah, it's an interesting, it's a very interesting one from a technical standpoint. Yeah. All right, we'll jump to it. You got me. Okay, so yeah, this was the encore slide in case this came up. It almost always does. Okay, so this is kind of visually a way to think about SQL PAL and how SQL Server is running on Windows, or on Linux, excuse me. So the idea here is, we have our core relational database, analysis services, integration services, reporting services, conceivably could be done in the same way, although, again, these are not in scope for the SQL Server that's being released next year. We built this platform abstraction layer that includes a host extension, both for Windows and for Linux, and this is similar to the way other relational database providers get their cross-platform support by building an abstraction layer. And this abstraction layer, it includes Win32-like APIs, and it's the same SQL Server binaries that are calling into these things. And then we have this SQL OS that has existed for a while, and we've basically been building this SQL OS v2 that vastly expands what the SQL OS is able to do. And in part, what we're doing is we're making sure that the really performance-sensitive calls go directly through and go straight to this host extension to be remapped to the appropriate syscalls. And so that's how we're making sure that the performance is top-notch, and there's no obvious overhead there. So this is kind of the 30,000-foot, well, 10,000-foot view of kind of how we're making SQL Server work on Linux. I know that there will be more talked about in the coming months, so I would keep an eye out for more information on the internals of how we're making this work. Similarly to what the, if you've followed the Windows subsystem for Linux with Windows 10, similarly to what that team has done to talk about how are they making that work. We'd like to do a similar kind of thing for talking about how we're making this work.
Any future plan of supporting IBM Linux?
Of supporting?
IBM Linux?
Nothing that I can talk about right now. Nothing that I can talk about right now. Again, with everything here, we're prioritizing stuff based on what customers ask for. And so if you have, and in particular, if you have real workloads that you're itching to get up and running, that'll get our attention. So if you have that kind of stuff, I'd love to chat about it. So any other questions? I know we're over time. All right, so with that, thank you all very much.